Startling high-resolution satellite images that we'll now share with you indicate that ongoing border talks between Bhutan and China to formally demarcate their boundary have not prevented Beijing from continuing unsanctioned construction activity in North Bhutan's Jakarlung Valley. The extent of the Chinese construction in this also suggests that Thimphu may have no option but to accept the fait accompli presented by the Chinese in this area, which incidentally lies just 50 kilometers from Bhutan's eastern border with Arunachal Pradesh. Now, the satellite image that you see here covers the expanse of Chinese construction activity in one part of the Jakarlung Valley to Bhutan's north. You just saw one Chinese-built enclave. You can now see the road network, and finally, in a few seconds, what you will see is a second Chinese enclave in this area. So where is this area? On this map, we can show you 4 areas where China has illegally entered Bhutan and constructed villages and military outposts. Let's zoom into the Jakarlung area that we are focusing on. The yellow area is what we will be closely looking at. You can also see the Chinese road network clearly marked here. The image that you now see is from August 2021. The Chinese had entered this area, but take a look at this. This is the very same area, entirely built up. There are more than 100 residential homes here. This image just 4 days old. Let's now give you another example. What you see here is a dug up area from August 2021 next to a road under construction. This is the same area, a second new enclave in the Jakarlung area that we are focusing on. Again, this image just 4 days old. While the area that we have shown you concerns a Chinese cross-border land grab of North Bhutan, a tiny country, let's turn our attention to another area, Doklam, where India and China had a tense 2-month-plus standoff in 2017. Let's zoom into the Doklam area. The area to the left of the image is where the 2017 standoff between India and China took place. We marked that entire area. But it is this area to the east and directly adjacent to Doklam which is now of great concern to Delhi, the Amuchu River Valley, Bhutanese territory where China is illegally constructing villages. In simple terms, China is constructing south from this axis, and India cannot accept any further creep towards the Siliguri corridor. That's the narrow sliver of land that connects the northeast with the rest of the country. Well, joining us now, Ambassador Gautam Bambawale, India's former envoy to China, somebody who's looked at Chinese actions all across our frontier very closely. Indeed, thanks so very much for being with us. Is there anything that India can do other than to just watch as the Chinese just relentlessly occupy illegally territory in Bhutan to the east, to the north and to the southwest?
You're absolutely right, Vishnu, that the images that you have shown from a few days ago seem to indicate very clearly that the Chinese are building all kinds of infrastructure in the northern part of Bhutan. As you know, Bhutan is a very small country with a population of just 7.5 lakh people. It has a very small army which is not capable of tracking developments all over their borders across the length and breadth of the country. And therefore, it's quite possible that the Chinese have actually built these kind of structures well into Bhutanese territory. What we do about them is a different matter altogether. There's not much that India can do, but I think we can join our voice with that of the international community to call out Chinese actions.
Ambassador, isn't this essentially about China pushing south towards the Siliguri corridor or in areas where, Bhutan has been a wedge between India and China?
No, that's absolutely right, Vishnu, that they are pushing south. The unfortunate part of all this is it shows China's expansionist mind, the way China thinks, the way China is aggressive across the globe, but particularly in its border regions. And I think that's what's happening in the northern part of Bhutan. I think we all have to work together with the international community and tell China that this is not going to be tolerated by anyone. But it is far away from India, Vishnu, so we have to leave it to the Bhutanese to handle it as they think best.
It's just about 50 kilometers on the east, Ambassador, about 200 kilometers from Doklam. So it's relatively close, but you're quite right. I mean, we don't share a boundary with, or in that area or close by. I'm just trying to understand the pattern of the Chinese over here, whether it's in the South China Sea all the way to eastern Ladakh. It is to occupy, to construct, and then to negotiate. In other words, just sort of say that we are here, we built up, and therefore this is ours. It seems to be a thought out tactic of theirs, and we've seen it everywhere.
Absolutely. You are 100% correct there, Vishnu, that what the Chinese do, whether it's in the South China Sea or now here in northern Bhutan, that they take actual control of the ground and then they negotiate from there. But in our negotiations and in negotiations that other countries have with China, they should very clearly tell them that whatever has happened on the ground is one thing, but our claims on what we think is our territory is irrespective of what the situation on the ground is. And you're absolutely right that what China believes in is to change the status quo on the ground. It does that everywhere, including in the South China Sea, on the India-China boundary, and now in northern Bhutan.
Ambassador, and that's the key point, because there are agreements which they violate. Article 7 of the 2015 bilateral agreement between India and China clearly says that the status quo of populations in areas which are disputed must be maintained. The Chinese don't seem to care about that. They construct in areas, and therefore if you have a village here or a village there, you say, no, there's a village, it's my village, the intention is to populate, and therefore this is my land. But that is against the text of that agreement. It is against that spirit of that agreement. So, I mean, it just goes to show they don't really care about what they signed.
You're right, Vishnu. And in fact, even Bhutan and China have certain agreements between them which are very similar to the agreements between India and China. And the crux of those agreements, the starting point of each of those agreements, is that neither side will change the status quo on the ground. And this sort of construction work that you have highlighted in your story tonight, Vishnu, clearly shows that that is not the case. The Chinese keep changing the status quo on the ground, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in northern Bhutan, or whether it's on the India-China boundary. So that is something that is not, keeping to the letter and rule of the agreements that the Chinese themselves have signed with some of their neighboring countries like Bhutan and India.
Ambassador, when you were in Beijing as ambassador, we were going through, I believe, the Doklam crisis at that period. When you confronted the Chinese, I mean, obviously diplomatically and deftly, carefully, because it was obviously a sensitive issue, were they ever in denial of agreements or the law? How did they state their position? Because to us, looking at Doklam and looking at what's been happening since then, it doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. No, you're right there, Vishnu, that, I don't think they factor in that by doing these kind of things which change the status quo on the ground, they're actually violating some of the bilateral agreements that they have either with India or in this particular case with Bhutan. And I don't know if they're willing to accept that. But as we have seen in eastern Ladakh, that the Chinese are not willing to accept that they have not just violated, but they have actually gone against the letter of the agreements that exist to maintain peace and tranquility between India and China in the border areas.
Ambassador, therefore, when you see the status of the ties between India and China presently, are you optimistic of there being a lasting peace where we can go back to, say, what the situation was 7, 8, 9 years back when there was relative peace along the LAC?
No, I am unfortunately, Vishnu, and I must confess to you that a lot of people feel surprised when this comes from a former diplomat who's worked a lot in China. But I'm very pessimistic about the India-China relationship. It has actually, over the past 3 years, since the summer of 2020, deteriorated greatly. They continue to be in a pretty bad state of relationship. And I don't see any way out of this unless and until the Chinese restore the status quo ante where the India-China boundary in eastern Ladakh is concerned. Just a quick word on Bhutan. I think this is a time where India needs to stand with Bhutan. What you have revealed in your show today is something that the Bhutanese will follow and track very closely. This is a time when India needs to stand with Bhutan. I'd just like to conclude by saying, Vishnu, that I think the Bhutanese are very smart people, and they realize that the major the major challenge to their identity and their sovereignty and their territorial integrity comes from their north and not from their south.
Yeah, and I mean, what India has been doing and continues to do, the King was over here a couple of months back, is to continue to offer active economic assistance, participation in infrastructure projects, to open up more trade, all sorts of things. So India continues to engage Bhutan as the best of friends, right?
Absolutely. And therefore, conversely to what I said about India-China relations, I'm very, very bullish about the strength of relations between India and Bhutan. There are a few analysts and there are a few people who, are a bit negative on this front. I must say that as a former Indian ambassador to Bhutan too, Vishnu, apart from a former ambassador to China, that I'm very, very bullish and very, very positive about the strength and resilience of India-Bhutan relations.
All right, Ambassador Bambawale, wonderful speaking to you. Thank you very much. All of this represents a challenge, a huge one to one of our closest partners, Bhutan, but it also represents a challenge at another level to India. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. We're going to take a short break at this stage. There's a lot more coming up right here on NDTV 24/7.